As Steve said earlier, NGA and I have been very heavily involved in a lot of crown rot tolerance trials over the last 3 or 4 years. And although those trials started off particularly with a focus on crown rot, it was clear after about 2 years that we were seeing very compelling trends to indicate that P.thornei was having a big impact, and in particular was having a very big impact in terms of the varietal results. There were 22 trials in that series of work, and what we were seeing was really the impact of P.thornei on yield, which is, as the first two speakers said, is what we see as tolerance. And that's where we were seeing up to a 30% yield loss in Strzelecki. You can do the maths very easily in terms of dollars per hectare that was being lost. About 10 months ago, though, we decided that those trial sites provided an ideal opportunity to really test out the other side, which is the resistance side of the story, and how these varieties were increasing nematodes. We did 3 sites last year, we did 2 sites, and Steve and Guy McMullen did a 3rd site down at Coonamble. And then we've also been testing over the last 3 or 4 weeks on sites with multiple varieties from 2010. Although some of this will be a little bit of replication, this was the first data we had back in May, June last year, where there were 3 trials. There are 8 different wheat, barley and durum varieties which were sown at all those sites, at North Star, at Ballatta and down at Coonamble. And as you can see, when you put them all together, you've got the P.thornei population per kilogram of soil across the axis here. We had this group of durums at the top, some bread wheats and barley varieties close behind, but then this very clear difference to a variety like Sunco with 2 to 3 times the number of nematodes. And as you can see with Strzelecki, something like 4 to 5 times the number of nematodes. And when you see that pattern happening across 3 different trials scattered by 500 kilometres, you start to think there's some real effects going on. There were a number of other varieties that were only included at 1 or 2 of those sites. Steve put up the ones which are in green, which were the varieties at the Coonamble site. We had an additional couple of varieties, Ventura and Skiff, in the northern trials. And what I'm trying to show here, again, we had a couple of durum varieties which have trended to the bottom in terms of nematode build-up. Across the top here are those varieties from the previous slide, so you've got a little bit of an idea of where they benchmark. It's not perfect science, but it's as good as we could get from that data. And so certainly when you start to get down to varieties such as Ellison and Sunvex, you really got some questionable build-up of Pradolinkus thornei. So we might not have the data yet in terms of what the best varieties are, but we've probably been able to identify fairly quickly 4 or 5 of those varieties which you've just got to avoid at all costs if you've got thornei in your country. To the recent data, so this is data, the samples were only taken 3 or 4 weeks ago. The data's probably only been available for a week. This is data from stripe rust trials. Any of you who were here yesterday, we were talking about work on moderately resistant stripe rust varieties. So we had multiple varieties. We've tested every site before planting. Moree and Taluna had reasonably high numbers of nematodes. And what we've done in the last few weeks is gone back in to sample those nematode numbers, and we've actually found some pretty consistent numbers between the trials. Again, if you look at the top, the 2 durum varieties, Caparoi and Belaroi, certainly looking like they are better than the bread wheats. There's a consistent message there. The only difference here from what we saw in 2009 or 2010 sampling is that Gregory has probably slipped back a little bit compared to Wiley. We had another site which was actually a herbicide plant pack site, where we had a barley, a durum, a bread wheat and also a chickpea. This particular site we started with 21,000 nematodes per kilo, And that's probably an unsustainable population for nematodes, and actually it's come down with every one of those crops that were grown. Again, what are the messages here? Have a look at the top. It's the durum variety again, which seems to be holding that nematode increase a little bit lower. Barley a little bit intermediate. This is probably some data which might not challenge what Kirsty's got, but might say we've got to look more at some of these chickpea varieties. Certainly Hattrick didn't perform very well in this particular situation. In terms of key messages, and I think you will have got them fairly soundly from most of the speakers this morning, durums, in terms of the build-up of Pratlingus thornei, have been consistently fairly good. They might not be reducing the numbers, but they're going to be holding them at a fairly low level. Barley in all this work, when we started it 12 months ago, we're expecting barley to be pretty well up towards the top. It's pretty intermediate. It's really in there with most of the bread wheats in terms of susceptibility. The bread wheats, a lot of them seem to be in that mid category, but we are seeing some extremely poor varieties in there as well. And so there's, as I said before, 4 or 5 varieties you've got to avoid like the plague if you've got Pratlingus thornei in your country. And as Steve said earlier, variety choice appears much more important for managing Pratlingus thornei than it does in terms of crown rot. Conclusions, fairly simple. Know your paddock status, know your farm status. If you're lucky like Vic and at Goondiwindi, there's a lot of soil types that don't have these nematodes. Now, you're in a great situation there. You want to avoid getting soil moved onto your property at all costs. If you've got it only in a couple of paddocks, try to change your practices so you're not moving it around on your own property. Certainly increase focus on variety selection. We were very comfortable. There were big yield losses with some of these varieties under nematode pressure, but when you combine that with the nematode build-up we're seeing with varieties like Strzelecki and Sunco and Sunvex and Ellison, you've got this double whammy effect going on, and that's apart from an additive effect on crown rot. And then finally, of course, start considering growing more resistant crops in those problem paddocks. This isn't a problem that you're going to eliminate over 1 year, 2 years, 3 years. It's something you're going to have to live with and manage. And those are the paddocks that you're probably going to have to increase your frequency of sorghum, might be dryland cotton depending on where you are, or some of the other crops with better resistance. And I'll leave it there.